Imagine you are a 23-year-old Irish woman standing in the back hallway of a Fifth Avenue mansion in 1891. You earn $25 a month. You change the sheets. And last Tuesday, you changed the sheets in a bedroom where the master's wife does not sleep. You know what that means. The woman of this house spends $300,000 a year to convince New York she is untouchable. You could end her with a single conversation. The question is not whether you have power. The question is what your silence is worth. In the mansions of Gilded Age America, the servants who dressed, bathed, and attended the richest families on earth discovered that silence was a currency and secrets were worth more than a lifetime of wages. This is the story of that currency, how it was minted, how it was spent, and what happened when the payment stopped. Chapter 1: 40 servants and not a single witness. The breakers had 33 servants, 70 rooms, and one rule that mattered more than any other: do not be seen. That was the fundamental contract of domestic service in Gilded Age America. You could live inside the most expensive private residence on the continent. You could walk its halls at dawn before the family stirred. You could know who slept where, who drank too much, who wept behind closed doors. But you were never, under any circumstance, to acknowledge what you knew. The breakers, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, cost more than $7 million to build in 1895. Adjusted for today's money, that figure exceeds $200 million. The house contained 70 rooms spread across 5 floors, with a great hall rising 45 feet to a painted ceiling imported panel by panel from Italy. Platinum and gold leaf covered surfaces that most visitors would never touch. A coal-fired boiler system beneath the basement generated enough heat to warm 30,000 square feet of Italian marble. And threading through every floor, invisible to the family and their guests, ran a second architecture: the servants' passages. These were narrow corridors built between the walls, connecting the kitchen to the dining room, the laundry to the bedrooms, the nursery to the back stairs. They existed for one reason: so that a footman carrying a silver tray of oysters could move from the basement kitchen to the second-floor dining room without ever crossing the sightline of a Vanderbilt. The call bell system, an intricate network of wires and numbered bells mounted on a board in the servants' hall, allowed the family to summon service without raising their voices. Bell number 14 meant Mrs. Vanderbilt required her lady's maid. Bell number 7 meant the gentleman's study needed coal. Each bell was labeled. Each bell demanded instant, silent response. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's fortune at the time of the breakers' construction stood at approximately $105 million. His lady's maid earned roughly $300 a year. The ratio between the master's wealth and a single servant's annual income was 350,000 to 1. That number is not an abstraction. It is the precise measurement of the distance between the person who owned the secret and the person who knew it. Consider the mathematics of surveillance. 33 servants staffed the breakers during the summer season alone. A cook, a pastry chef, 2 kitchen maids, a butler, a head footman, 6 additional footmen, a housekeeper, 4 housemaids, 2 laundresses, a lady's maid, a valet, a nursemaid, a coachman, 2 grooms, a gardener, and several others whose titles shifted with the season. Each of these individuals occupied a specific station in the household. Each station required access to specific rooms, specific schedules, specific routines. the lady's maid entered the mistress's bedroom before the mistress was dressed. The valet entered the master's chambers before the master was awake. The housemaid emptied the wastepaper baskets. The laundress knew which garments bore stains that should not exist. The nursemaid knew which nights the children were left alone. Between them, these 33 people possessed a complete and continuous record of everything that happened inside the breakers, every day, every night, for the entire summer season. And yet, by the official record, none of them ever saw anything. This was not loyalty. This was architecture. The back hallways were not merely convenient passages for discreet service. They were instruments of a system designed to separate knowledge from power. The servant saw everything. The servant said nothing. And the distance between those two facts was measured in dollars. In 1890, New York City's population included approximately 250,000 domestic servants. That was roughly 16% of the entire city. 1 in 6 New Yorkers changed the sheets, polished the silver, or emptied the chamber pots of the other 5. They formed the largest single category of employment in the city, outnumbering factory workers, outnumbering clerks, outnumbering every other trade. They were, in the most literal sense, everywhere. They were also, by design, nowhere. The servant was a ghost who cooked your dinner, a phantom who buttoned your dress, an invisible hand that warmed your bed with a copper pan of coals 30 minutes before you retired. The entire system depended on treating human beings as furniture that could follow instructions. The hiring process reinforced this erasure. Servants were recruited through intelligence offices, which were agencies that functioned like labor auctions. Prospective employers examined references, appearance, and temperament before selecting a candidate. Irish girls were preferred for kitchen and cleaning work because they spoke English and accepted the institutional discipline of Catholic upbringing. Swedish and German women were favored for cooking. French women commanded the highest wages as ladies' maids because their accent conferred status on the household. English butlers were the apex of the domestic hierarchy, their salaries sometimes exceeding $500 a year, because their presence signaled that the employer had achieved a level of refinement that required a professional to maintain it. Once hired, the servant entered a world of total institutional control. Her meals were prescribed, her uniform was mandated, her hours of rest were specified, usually 1 afternoon off per week and every other Sunday. Her bedroom, typically in the attic or the basement, was furnished with an iron bed, a washstand, and a small mirror. She owned nothing in that room except her clothing. She existed in the house, but did not belong to it. But furniture does not listen, furniture does not remember, and furniture does not talk. The servants did all 3, and the families who employed them were about to discover what that cost. Chapter 2: The Woman Who Decided Who Existed. Caroline Astor spent $300,000 a year to maintain a reputation that one chambermaid could destroy in an afternoon. Mrs. Astor, born Caroline Webster Schermerhorn, married into the Astor fortune, and then did something that no amount of Astor money had previously accomplished. She turned New York society into a fortress, and she held the only key. Her instrument was the list. Working with Ward McAllister, a Southern-born social arbiter who understood that exclusivity was a product that could be manufactured, Mrs. Astor defined the boundaries of acceptable New York society with terrifying precision. McAllister reportedly told the press that there were only about 400 people in New York who mattered. The number was not arbitrary. It was the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom at 355th Avenue. If you could not fit inside that room, you did not exist. The Social Register, first published in 1887, formalized what Mrs. Astor's ballroom had established informally. This slim volume, bound in black and orange, listed the names and addresses of every family deemed acceptable by the self-appointed guardians of New York society. To be removed from the register was social execution. No trial, no appeal. Your name simply vanished from the next edition, and every door it had previously opened closed simultaneously. The calling card system enforced these boundaries at the household level. When a woman wished to maintain or establish a social connection, she left her card at the target's home. A card with one corner folded meant a personal visit. 2 corners folded meant congratulations. The upper right corner folded meant the visit was purely formal. A card left unfolded was the most serious gesture of all. And who managed this system? Who received the cards at the door, examined the corners, placed them on the silver tray, and delivered them to the mistress of the house? The servants. A single footman standing at the front entrance of Mrs. Astor's mansion held more operational knowledge of New York's social warfare than any gossip columnist in the city. He knew who called. He knew who was turned away. He knew which cards were placed on the tray and which were quietly set aside. He knew who came in the front door and who came in the back. He knew which visitors arrived in the morning and which arrived after midnight. The stakes of this knowledge were not trivial. They were existential. When Mrs. Astor decided that a family no longer belonged, the consequences cascaded instantly. Invitations stopped. Calling cards went unreturned. Church pews felt suddenly more spacious. The women who had lunched with the condemned family on Tuesday pretended not to see them on Wednesday. Children's friendships dissolved. Business partnerships cooled. Marriage prospects evaporated. This was not gossip. This was economic destruction dressed in silk. A society family's credit, their access to favorable marriages, their ability to participate in business ventures that required social trust, all of it depended on standing. And standing depended on Mrs. Astor's approval. And Mrs. Astor's approval depended on a system that her servants operated every single day. The annual cost of maintaining the Astor household ran to $300,000, an amount that could have paid the wages of 1,000 housemaids for an entire year. That money purchased food, flowers, champagne, musicians, livery for the footmen, maintenance of the mansion, and above all, the appearance of effortless superiority. But it also purchased something far more fragile. It purchased the silence of every person who worked inside those walls. Because a chambermaid who cleaned Mrs. Astor's private rooms knew truths that could shatter the fortress. She knew whether the mistress slept alone. She knew what medicines sat on the nightstand. She knew which letters arrived and which were burned. She knew the difference between the public Mrs. Astor, diamond stomacher blazing beneath a portrait of herself as a queen, and the private Mrs. Astor, whoever that woman might have been. This knowledge was the invisible foundation beneath every ballroom, every calling card, every folded corner. The entire reputation economy of Gilded Age New York was built on the assumption that the people who saw everything would say nothing. It was an assumption, not a guarantee. And the distance between assumption and guarantee was about to be measured in the most public, most humiliating, and most expensive way imaginable. Chapter 3. What the valet found in his master's pockets. Every morning, the valet emptied the pockets, and every morning, the pockets told the truth. A crumpled receipt from a restaurant where the master did not dine with his wife. A monogrammed handkerchief that bore initials not matching anyone in the household. A theater stub for a Tuesday evening performance when the master had told Mrs. Vanderbilt he would be at his club. The valet pressed the trousers, cataloged the contents, and returned both to their proper places. He did this every morning. He remembered everything. He said nothing. The intimacy of Gilded Age domestic service was physical in ways that modern life cannot easily comprehend. A lady's maid did not merely select clothing. She dressed and undressed her mistress. She saw every bruise. She fastened every corset. She brushed hair for 30 minutes each evening while her mistress sat before a mirror, and sometimes, in the privacy of that routine, spoke freely. The maid heard confessions that no priest would receive. She was closer to her employer's body than the employer's husband was. The valet occupied the same territory on the opposite side of the household. He shaved the master's face each morning, a task requiring the master to sit still and trust a servant with a blade against his throat. He laid out clothing. He managed correspondence that the master did not wish to handle through the official channels of a secretary. In many households, the valet was the only person who knew the master's complete daily schedule, including the appointments that did not appear on the family calendar. The nurse occupied perhaps the most dangerous position of all. She watched the children, yes, but she also watched the parents watching the children. She knew which parent visited the nursery and which did not. She knew whether the mother's headaches were genuine or tactical. She counted the laudanum bottles. She measured the brandy. She saw the arguments that stopped when the drawing room doors opened and resumed the moment they closed. These three roles, the lady's maid, the valet, and the nurse, formed what we might call the inner ring of the servant surveillance architecture. They had unrestricted access to the most private moments of their employers' lives. And the information they accumulated was not abstract. It was specific, dated, and devastating. Consider Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore and heir to a fortune that still numbered among the largest in America at the turn of the century. Alfred's private life was an open secret among New York society, but it remained officially unknown because official knowledge required evidence, and evidence required witnesses. When his affair with Mary Agnes O'Brien Ruiz became public, it was servant testimony that turned private knowledge into public fact. The resulting scandal contributed to the end of his first marriage and damaged a reputation that the Vanderbilt name could no longer automatically protect. The pattern repeated across dozens of households. The specific knowledge of servants, their ability to testify about who was in which bedroom on which night, who arrived at what hour, who left in what condition, made them the most powerful witnesses in any divorce proceeding, any blackmail scheme, any custody battle that touched the Gilded Age elite. And here lay the psychological paradox that defined every servant's existence. You were simultaneously the most trusted person in the household and the greatest threat to its survival. Your employer needed you close enough to button their shirt, but wanted you far enough away to forget you were human. The relationship was an impossible negotiation conducted silently, daily, across a distance of inches. Some servants navigated this paradox for decades without incident, retiring with modest savings and the quiet satisfaction of having kept faith with families that rarely acknowledge their existence. Others were dismissed suddenly, sometimes for cause, sometimes without. and found themselves on the street with a lifetime of secrets and no paycheck to purchase their continued silence. The system worked as long as both sides honored the transaction. The employer paid, the servant forgot. Money flowed in one direction. Information stayed frozen in place. But transactions require trust. And trust, in a world built on purchased invisibility, was the most expensive commodity of all. What happened when the money stopped flowing was about to become the most public scandal in American history. Chapter 4. The Man Who Sold Shame for $1,500. Colonel William Dalton Mann did not need to break into mansions because the servants opened the doors for him. Mann was not really a colonel, though he had served in the Civil War with enough distinction to borrow the rank permanently. He was not a journalist, though he owned a publication. He was not a socialite, though he dined with millionaires. What Colonel Mann was, with a precision that bordered on genius, was a businessman who understood a single market inefficiency. The gap between what the rich did in private and what the public was allowed to know. In 1891, Mann purchased Town Topics, a weekly gazette that covered New York society with a mixture of flattery and menace. The publication's front section, called Saunterings, offered chatty reports on parties, travel, and fashion. Its content was sharp, occasionally witty, and seemingly harmless. But the column's power lay not in what it printed, but in what it threatened to print. Mann's method was elegant and ruthless. His network of informants, which included servants, tradespeople, hotel employees, and disgruntled social climbers, fed him a continuous stream of private information about New York's wealthiest families. Affairs, debts, drinking, illegitimate children, business frauds, medical secrets. He collected them all with the care of an archivist and the eye of an accountant. Once he possessed a damaging secret, Mann did not rush to publish. Instead, he offered the target a choice. For a subscription fee to his companion publication, Fads and Fancies of Representative Americans, typically priced between $1,500 and $2,500, the target could secure a glowing biographical profile. The implied alternative was simple: decline the subscription, and the secret might find its way into the Saunterings column. This was blackmail refined to the level of a subscription service. Mann charged for praise the way an insurance company charges for coverage. The product he sold was not information. It was the absence of information. He monetized silence, and he did it at industrial scale. The numbers were staggering. During his trial in 1905, testimony revealed that Mann had collected payments from some of the most powerful names in American life. J.P. Morgan, William C. Whitney, Charles M. Schwab, Collis Huntington. The individual payments ranged from $500 to more than $25,000. One estimate placed Mann's total income from this enterprise at well over $100,000 annually, at a time when the average American family earned roughly $750 a year. Mann's genius was recognizing that the servant information economy, which had operated informally for decades, could be centralized. Individual servants had always possessed the ability to sell what they knew, but they lacked distribution networks, legal protection, and the social standing to approach targets directly. Mann provided all three. He was the middleman who connected the supply of secrets with the demand for silence. His informants inside the great houses were rarely named, but the nature of his information made their identities obvious. The details he published or threatened to publish were not the kind gathered through casual observation. They were specific, bedroom specific, bathroom specific. They included information about the timing of visits, the identity of visitors, the contents of private correspondence, and the presence or absence of spouses during particular evenings. This was information that only someone with intimate household access could provide. The servants who fed Mann his intelligence were engaged in a transaction that violated every principle of the domestic service contract. They were selling the silence they had been paid to maintain. But the economics were hard to argue with. A housemaid earning $25 a month could receive $50 or more for a single piece of information. That was 2 months' wages for 10 minutes of conversation. Against that math, loyalty was a luxury. The flow of information into town topics followed established channels. Hotel chambermaids reported which rooms were occupied and by whom. Restaurant waiters noted which couples dined in private rooms. Carriage drivers tracked late-night destinations. But the most valuable intelligence came from inside the houses themselves. A lady's maid could report the content of private letters. A footman could confirm which guests stayed past midnight. A cook could describe the quantity of champagne ordered for an evening that was supposed to be a quiet dinner with family friends. Mann cultivated these sources with professional care. He paid promptly. He never revealed his informants, and he understood that the best intelligence came from servants who felt wronged. A dismissed maid with unpaid wages. A valet fired without references. A nurse let go after discovering something the family preferred she not know. These were Mann's most prolific sources. They had no remaining loyalty to protect. They had debts to settle, and Mann gave them the means to settle them. The scale of Mann's operation became clear during the 1905 proceedings. One witness testified that Mann kept detailed files on more than 200 prominent families. Another described a system of coded notebooks in which Mann recorded the specific information he held on each target, with annotations indicating how much the information was worth and how much the target had already paid. The system was bureaucratic in its thoroughness. Mann ran a blackmail enterprise with the organizational discipline of a bank. Mann's system collapsed in 1905 when he was brought to trial on charges of perjury, though the underlying accusation was extortion. The trial became a sensation. Witness after witness from New York's elite testified to having paid Mann's subscription fees. The courtroom heard names that had never before appeared in connection with anything so vulgar as a blackmail payment. The 400 were forced to admit, publicly, that they had been purchasing their own privacy from a man who had purchased it first from their servants. Mann was acquitted on the perjury charge. The acquittal was widely interpreted as a verdict not on his innocence, but on the jury's reluctance to punish a man for doing openly what the entire system did quietly. He continued to publish town topics until his death in 1920, though his influence declined steadily as new technologies and changing social norms reduced the value of the kind of secrets he traded. But the machine he built left a permanent mark. Mann demonstrated that privacy was not a right, but a commodity. It could be bought, sold, brokered, and resold. The only question was price. And price, as the next decade would demonstrate with increasing violence, depended entirely on what the servant had seen and how badly the employer needed the world not to know. The Mann trial embarrassed New York society, but embarrassment was still manageable. The rich could absorb embarrassment. What they could not absorb was the kind of exposure that destroyed not just reputation, but physical safety. And in a castle in Austria, that kind of exposure was already taking shape. Chapter 5. The Whip, the Castle, and the Servants Who Heard Nothing. Harry Thaw placed his servants at one end of the castle and his wife at the other, and for 2 weeks the distance swallowed her screams. Harry Kendall Thaw was born into Pittsburgh steel money. His family's fortune came from coke and coal, and it was substantial enough to insulate him from the consequences of behavior that would have committed a poorer man to an institution years earlier. Thaw was violent, erratic, and obsessed. His obsession centered on Evelyn Nesbit, the most photographed woman in America, a former chorus girl who had been the mistress of the architect Stanford White before Thaw pursued her with a persistence that crossed every line of decency. Thaw married Nesbit in 1905. Before the wedding and after it, he subjected her to treatment that the trial testimony would later describe in terms that shocked even the reporters who had expected the worst. At Katzenstein Castle, a rented property in the Austrian countryside, the nature of that treatment became clear. What concerns our story is not the violence itself, but its architecture. Thaw did not simply abuse his wife. He engineered the conditions of her abuse with a deliberate understanding of the servant witness problem. He rented a castle rather than staying in a hotel because a castle's corridors were long enough to create distance between bedrooms and servants' quarters. He placed the servants at one end of the building and kept Evelyn at the other. The separation was not accidental. It was calculated. Thaw understood something that most of his social peers understood only instinctively, that servants were witnesses, and witnesses were dangerous. By controlling the physical distance between the servants and the acts he intended to commit, he was manipulating the same architectural logic that the Vanderbilts had built into the breakers. The back hallways were designed to keep servants invisible. Thaw reversed the equation. He used distance to keep the crime invisible to the servants. The precise layout of Katzenstein Castle became evidence. The castle's floor plan showed corridors extending more than 200 feet from the servants' wing to the rooms where Thaw and Nesbit were quartered. Stone walls, heavy wooden doors, and multiple turns in the hallway created a sound barrier that would have muffled any noise below a sustained scream. Thaw had measured this distance. He had tested it. He had chosen the castle specifically because its architecture offered what a hotel room or a city townhouse could not: a guarantee that the servants' quarters were beyond earshot. This was not paranoia, it was planning, and it reflected a sophisticated understanding of the servant economy that most employers possessed but rarely articulated. Every wealthy household in America was designed to minimize the chance that servants would witness inconvenient truths. Thaw simply extended this logic to its darkest conclusion. If the household architecture was designed to keep servants from seeing, he would design his temporary household to keep servants from hearing. The servants at Katzenstein, according to later testimony, heard nothing. Whether this was true or whether their silence was purchased is a question that the historical record does not fully resolve. What is clear is that Thaw believed the arrangement would work. He trusted the same system that every Gilded Age employer trusted, that servants could be positioned, managed, and paid to not know what they knew. The arrangement held until June 25, 1906, when Thaw shot Stanford White in the face on the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden. The murder was witnessed by hundreds of people and required no servant testimony to establish. But the trials that followed, 2 of them extending through 1907 and 1908, turned on a question that only intimate witnesses could answer. Was Harry Thaw insane? To answer that question, the prosecution and defense both needed evidence of Thaw's private behavior, and private behavior meant servant testimony. Evelyn Nesbitt's own testimony provided the most devastating details, but the legal arguments required corroboration. The question of what the servants at Katzenstein had known and when they had known it became a strategic battleground. If the servants had witnessed Thaw's violence and said nothing, their silence suggested that Thaw's behavior was chronic, predictable, and therefore evidence of a deranged mind rather than a momentary passion. If they had truly heard nothing, the defense could argue that the events were isolated, that Thaw's actions on the night of the murder were an aberration rather than a pattern. Nesbitt's description of the events at Katzenstein became the most quoted testimony of the trial. She described a whip. She described screaming. She described days of confinement. And she described the servants going about their duties at the opposite end of the castle as though nothing unusual were happening. The image was devastating. A young woman suffering while a staff of paid employees maintained the fiction that nothing was wrong. The public understood, perhaps for the first time, that servant silence was not always loyalty. Sometimes it was complicity. The Thaw defense team attempted to deploy servants as character witnesses, finding staff members who would testify that Thaw was a generous employer, a kind master, a man incapable of the sustained cruelty Nesbitt described. This produced the spectacle of servants being used as weapons by both sides of the same case. The prosecution's servants proved violence through their silence. The defense's servants denied violence through their testimony. The jury was left to decide which group of servants to believe. The trials became a national sensation. Newspapers sold hundreds of thousands of additional copies on days when testimony about Thaw's private life was expected. The public appetite for details about what happened behind the closed doors of the wealthy was bottomless. And the testimony revealed something that the 400 had long feared, that the system of purchase silence could be reversed, that servants who had been paid to say nothing could be compelled by subpoena to say everything. Thaw was found not guilty by reason of insanity in his second trial in 1908 and committed to the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. He escaped in 1913, was recaptured, and eventually released in 1915. He spent the rest of his life cycling between freedom and institutional confinement, his fortune slowly diminishing. The Thaw case established a principle that would echo through every subsequent scandal involving the wealthy and their servants. Silence was not a permanent condition. It was a temporary arrangement sustained by money, enforced by social pressure, and vulnerable to any legal proceeding that could compel testimony. The servants who heard nothing at Katzenstein may have genuinely heard nothing, or they may have heard everything and been paid to forget. Either way, the lesson was the same. You could build your castle long enough to swallow screams. You could place the servants far enough away to claim ignorance. But the law could reach into that distance and pull the truth out. And in New York, the law was about to reach into the most intimate spaces of the Vanderbilt family itself. Chapter 6. The price of a divorce was a maid's confession. Under New York law, the only way to end a marriage was to prove adultery, and the only people who could prove it slept in the servants' quarters. This was not an oversight. It was a design. New York maintained the most restrictive divorce statute in the United States throughout the Gilded Age and well into the 20th century. Adultery was the sole ground for divorce. No amount of cruelty, abandonment, drunkenness, or financial ruin qualified. If you wanted your marriage dissolved in the state of New York, you had to prove that your spouse had been unfaithful. And proving it meant witnesses, not any witnesses, the right witnesses, witnesses who had been inside the bedroom, witnesses who had seen the evidence firsthand, witnesses who could testify under oath to specific acts on specific dates in specific locations. In practice, this meant servants. Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt understood this legal architecture with the cold clarity of a general studying a map before battle. In 1893, after years of a marriage that had become intolerable, Alva set about the systematic destruction of her husband, William Kissam Vanderbilt, using the only weapons the law would recognize. William K. Vanderbilt was no saint, and Alva knew it. His relationship with Nellie Neustretter, a woman from Nevada whose presence in his life was an open secret among the 400, provided the factual basis for what Alva needed. But facts were not enough. The law required evidence, and evidence required testimony, and testimony required someone who had been close enough to see what William K. preferred to keep hidden. The details of the Vanderbilt divorce proceedings, finalized in March of 1896, remain partially sealed. But the outline is clear from contemporary accounts and legal records. Alva's legal team assembled a case built largely on the observations of household servants and hotel employees. The Cataract House in Niagara Falls featured prominently. Private detectives supplemented the servant testimony with surveillance reports. The accumulated weight of this evidence was enough to secure the divorce and a settlement that the press estimated at $10 million. The Cataract House played a role that illustrated the broader mechanics of Gilded Age divorce espionage. Hotels were the most vulnerable point in any extramarital arrangement. Unlike private homes, where the staff could be controlled and their loyalty purchased, hotels employed workers whose allegiance belonged to whoever paid them last. A chambermaid at the Cataract House had no loyalty to William K. Vanderbilt. She had loyalty to her wages. And if a private detective offered her $20 for a description of who occupied which room on which night, the transaction was simple. The private detective industry thrived on exactly this dynamic. Firms in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia employed agents whose sole function was to corroborate the servant testimony that divorce cases required. These agents would follow a target, photograph entrances and exits, bribe hotel staff for room records, and compile reports that read like military intelligence assessments. The cost of a thorough investigation could run to several $1,000s. For a family like the Vanderbilts, the expense was trivial. For the servants and hotel workers who provided the raw intelligence, the payments were transformative. $10 million in 1896. Adjusted for purchasing power, that exceeds $300 million in modern terms. It was the largest publicly known divorce settlement in American history at the time, and its foundation was the testimony of people who earned $20 to $30 a month. The ratio deserves examination. $10 million divided among perhaps a dozen key witnesses would have yielded payments of roughly $800,000 each. In practice, the witnesses received nothing close to that amount. Their compensation, if any, remains undocumented. The servants who made the Vanderbilt divorce possible were the most essential participants in a $10 million transaction, and they were almost certainly the least compensated. But the financial asymmetry was not the cruelest outcome. The social consequences were. Alva Vanderbilt obtained her divorce. She proved her case. The law was on her side, and New York society punished her for winning. The punishment was coordinated without any visible coordination. No one issued an order. No committee convened. The response was organic, which made it more brutal than any organized action could have been. It emerged from the collective instinct of a class that understood, without discussion, that Alva had violated the one rule that mattered more than any law. She had allowed the private world to become public. She had put servants on a witness stand. She had opened the bedroom door and let strangers look inside. That could not be forgiven. The Sunday after the divorce was granted, Alva attended church. Every woman in the congregation pretended she was not there. Not one person spoke to her. Not one person acknowledged her presence. She had committed the unforgivable sin. She had made private knowledge public. She had allowed servants to speak. She had dragged the contents of the Vanderbilt bedroom into a courtroom. The fact that her husband was the adulterer was irrelevant. The crime, in the eyes of the 400, was exposure. This was the paradox at the heart of the Gilded Age reputation economy. The servants existed to maintain the private world. The law required the private world to be revealed. The society that demanded privacy punished anyone who allowed the revelation to occur. The woman who sought legal protection was destroyed by the very people whose own houses contained the same secrets. Alva's response was characteristically strategic. She married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont within the year, securing a new fortune and a new social base. She then devoted herself to the women's suffrage movement, channeling the fury of her social exile into political action that would, decades later, help reshape American law. But the scar of that Sunday morning in church never fully healed. The divorce colonies of Sioux Falls and Reno emerged as alternatives for those who could not face the servant testimony requirement of New York law. In South Dakota and later Nevada, divorce required only a period of residency and proof of incompatibility. No servants needed, no bedroom testimony required. The rich began leaving New York to end their marriages in states that asked fewer questions. But for those who stayed, the equation remained unchanged. Divorce required proof. Proof required witnesses. Witnesses lived in the servants' quarters, and the servants, whether they volunteered their testimony or were compelled by subpoena, held the key to every locked bedroom door in the city. The Alva Vanderbilt divorce was the most expensive demonstration of this principle. It would not be the most devastating. That distinction belonged to a case that would arrive nearly 40 years later, involving another Vanderbilt, another set of servants, and a child whose entire life would be determined by what a fired French maid decided to say in open court. Chapter 7. The French Maid Who Silenced a Courtroom. On October 1st, 1934, more than 100 reporters gathered for what they already called the trial of the century, and they had no idea what was coming. The case was formally titled Matter of Vanderbilt. It concerned the custody of Gloria Laura Vanderbilt, age 10, heiress to a trust fund of approximately $2.8 million, worth roughly $92 million in today's money. On one side stood her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, a 29-year-old widow whose husband, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, had drunk himself to death in 1925 and left his young wife with a child, a modest allowance from the trust, and a taste for European nightlife that the Vanderbilt family found unconscionable. On the other side stood Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the child's paternal aunt, a sculptor, art patron, and founder of the Whitney Museum, whose personal fortune dwarfed the trust fund under dispute. The legal question was simple: who should raise the child? The answer would be determined by the most complex and public examination of private behavior that an American courtroom had ever conducted. And the key witnesses were not lawyers, not relatives, not society figures. They were servants. Emma Sullivan Keislich had been little Gloria's nurse since infancy. She had lived with the child through years of transatlantic travel, through her mother's social circuit across Paris, Cannes, London, and Biarritz, through hotel suites and rented villas and the temporary homes that Gloria Morgan preferred to the stability that the Vanderbilt Trust was designed to provide. Keislich had watched. Keislich had remembered. And Keislich, when called to testify, spoke for 5 devastating hours. Her testimony painted a portrait of maternal negligence that was detailed, specific, and nearly impossible to refute. She described a child left in the care of servants while her mother attended parties. She described meals missed, bedtimes ignored, and a household organized around the mother's social schedule rather than the daughter's needs. She described Gloria Morgan's drinking, her late nights, and her relationships with men whose presence in the household Keislich documented with the thoroughness of a court reporter. Keislich's power as a witness came from her duration. She had not been in the household for weeks or months. She had been there for years. She had accumulated a continuous record of maternal behavior that no single incident could rebut. Her testimony was not a snapshot. It was a film. And the film showed a mother who treated her child as an accessory to a social life rather than as a human being who required care. The defense attacked Keislich's motives. She had remained in Gertrude Whitney's employment after little Gloria was placed in her aunt's temporary care. Her wages came from the Whitney household. Her future depended on the outcome of the case. These were legitimate challenges, but they did not address the content of her testimony, which was corroborated by hotel records, travel documents, and the testimony of other servants who had passed through Gloria Morgan's household during the years in question. The press reported every word. Newspapers across the country carried the testimony of a servant describing the private life of a Vanderbilt heiress with a specificity that the reading public found simultaneously shocking and irresistible. Keislich's testimony alone would have been enough to damage Gloria Morgan's case severely. But it was not Keislich who silenced the courtroom. It was Maria Caillot. Caillot was a French maid who had been employed by Gloria Morgan and subsequently dismissed. The circumstances of her dismissal are not fully clear in the record, but the consequence was unmistakable. Caillot had nothing left to lose. Her employment was over. Her references from the Vanderbilt household were worthless. The transaction that had purchased her silence, steady wages in exchange for discretion, had been terminated. And now, under subpoena, she was free to speak. What she said caused Justice John Francis Carew to clear the courtroom of all spectators and most of the press. Caillot testified about Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's intimate relationship with Lady Nada Milford Haven, a member of the extended British royal family. The testimony was explicit enough that the judge determined it could not be heard in open session. The courtroom was emptied, the doors were closed, and behind those doors, in a sealed proceeding that the press could only describe in the most oblique terms, Caillot provided testimony that transformed the custody trial into something far more scandalous than anyone had anticipated. The sealed nature of Caillot's testimony only magnified its power. Reporters who had been excluded from the courtroom wrote feverish accounts of what they imagined had been said. Guided by whispers from attorneys and court officials who violated the seal almost immediately. The speculation was worse than the facts could have been. The imagination of the press, unconstrained by the specifics of the testimony, created a version of events that was lurid beyond anything a court transcript could have supported. The sealed testimony also created a legal precedent that would be debated for years. Justice Caru's decision to clear the courtroom was based on his determination that the testimony was too explicit for public hearing. But the act of sealing created a vacuum that the press filled with speculation, rumor, and invention. The very mechanism designed to protect the dignity of the proceedings became the engine of the scandal. What could not be reported accurately was reported imaginatively, and the imaginative version was always worse than the truth. For Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the seal became a prison. She could not defend herself against specific allegations because the specific allegations were officially secret. She could not issue denials that addressed the actual testimony because the actual testimony was sealed. She was condemned by rumors about sealed words, unable to confront her accusers in the court of public opinion because the court of law had drawn the curtains. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's defense crumbled. Her attorneys attempted to impeach Kayot's credibility, pointing to her status as a discharged servant with a potential grudge. But the damage was structural, not personal. It was not merely that Kayot was angry, it was that she knew things, specific things. Things that only someone who had been inside the household, who had made the beds and drawn the baths and delivered the morning coffee, could possibly know. This was the detonation that the entire servant information economy had been building toward for half a century. A fired servant, a courtroom, a judge, and the truth delivered under oath about what happened behind closed doors. The 100 reporters who had gathered expecting a custody dispute found instead the most explosive demonstration of servant power in American legal history. A woman who had been paid to change the sheets had just changed a child's entire life. Chapter 8: The testimony that changed a child's life forever. The judge cleared the courtroom, but it was already too late because every reporter in New York had heard enough. In the weeks following Kayot's sealed testimony, the matter of Vanderbilt consumed the American press with an intensity that rivaled political news. The New York Daily News ran front-page coverage for weeks. The Daily Mirror and the Journal American competed for exclusive details. Estimates suggest that the trial generated more newspaper coverage in the fall of 1934 than any single event since the Lindbergh kidnapping 2 years earlier. The trial continued through October and into November. Witness after witness appeared: servants, friends, relatives, and finally the child herself. Little Gloria Vanderbilt, 10 years old, was brought before Justice Caru in his private chambers on October 24th. The press was excluded, the attorneys were present, and the child, whose testimony had been the subject of intense legal argument throughout the proceeding, told the judge that she did not want to live with her mother. The moment was devastating in its simplicity. A child surrounded by adults who were fighting over her inheritance, her upbringing, and ultimately her identity, stated a preference that aligned perfectly with the case built by her aunt's attorneys. Whether Gloria's preference was genuinely her own or the product of influence by Gertrude Whitney's household, where she had been living for more than a year, remains a question that biographers have debated for decades. What is not debatable is the weight the court gave it. The child's testimony was the final element in a case that had been constructed entirely from the observations of servants. Keislich had provided the narrative of neglect. Kayot had provided the explosive detail of private conduct. Other household staff had filled in the gaps with corroborating details about travel schedules, household routines, and the mother's prolonged absences. And now the child herself, the product of all these arrangements, confirmed what the servants had described. She did not want to go home. Legal scholars have noted that the matter of Vanderbilt established an important precedent in American custody law. The principle that a child's stated preference, even at age 10, could carry significant weight in a custody determination. But the precedent was built on a foundation of servant testimony. Without Kaislick's 5 hours on the stand, without Kayat's sealed revelations, without the corroborating details from other household employees, the child's preference would have been a single data point in an otherwise balanced case. The servant testimony created the context in which the child's preference became decisive. On November 21, 1934, Justice Carew issued his ruling. Custody of Gloria Laura Vanderbilt was awarded to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. The terms of the ruling dissected a mother's relationship with her daughter with surgical precision. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was granted visitation rights, Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock to Sunday evenings at 6 o'clock during the school year, 8 hours on Christmas Day, the month of July. These specific hours and days became the exact measurement of what a servant's testimony had cost a mother. The financial dimensions were equally precise. Gloria Morgan had been receiving $48,000 a year from the trust fund for the child's maintenance, a sum that the court now redirected to Gertrude Whitney's control. Gloria Morgan's own living expenses, previously subsidized through the trust, were reduced to a level that forced significant changes in her lifestyle. The 10-year-old heiress's trust fund of $2.8 million, generating income that would sustain her until she reached majority, became the financial battlefield on which every future dispute between mother and aunt would be fought. The cost of the trial itself was substantial. Legal fees for both sides were estimated at several $100,000. The court appointed a special guardian for the child whose own fees added to the total. The entire proceeding represented one of the most expensive custody battles in American history to that date. The press coverage extended the damage beyond the courtroom. The New York tabloids treated the trial as a serialized drama. The Daily News ran illustrations of the key participants alongside testimony summaries. Photographers staked out the courthouse, the Whitney mansion, and Gloria Morgan's apartment. Little Gloria became the most photographed child in America, a designation she had not sought and could not escape. Every image showed a girl surrounded by adults in dark coats, being guided into or out of an automobile, her face set in an expression that reporters described as confused and frightened, but which might simply have been the face of a 10-year-old who understood nothing of what was being done in her name. The trial also exposed the fragility of the Vanderbilt trust structure. The trust that Reginald Vanderbilt had established for his daughter was supposed to protect her from exactly this kind of disruption. Instead, the trust's income became the central prize in a custody fight that was as much about money as about parenting. Whoever controlled Gloria controlled the trust income. The guardian ad litem appointed to represent Gloria's interests noted in his report that both sides appeared more concerned with the disposition of the trust than with the welfare of the child. But the true cost was measured in damage that no financial accounting could capture. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt became, overnight, the most publicly disgraced woman in America. The sealed testimony of Maria Cayo had created a shadow narrative that the press amplified beyond all proportion. The words "unfit mother" followed her through the remainder of her life. She remarried, traveled, and maintained a reduced social existence, but the verdict of Justice Carew's courtroom was permanent. She had been judged by her servants, and the judgment stood. Little Gloria the child at the center of the storm, grew up in Gertrude Whitney's household, surrounded by wealth and culture, and the knowledge that her life had been determined by the words of people she barely knew. The nurse who had cared for her since infancy had testified against her mother. The French maid who had served in her household had delivered the most damaging testimony of all. Her own words, spoken to a judge in a private chamber at the age of 10, had sealed the outcome. The matter of Vanderbilt was not merely a custody case. It was a public demonstration of the principle that the entire Gilded Age had been built to conceal, that the servants knew everything, that their silence was not loyalty, but transaction, and that when the transaction ended, when the servant was dismissed and the wages stopped, the knowledge remained intact, specific, and available to anyone with the legal authority to compel its delivery. The courtroom had been cleared, but the secret was already out, and the legal system that had made the entire spectacle possible was about to face scrutiny of its own. Chapter 9. The Law That Protected the Guilty. The strangest part of the blackmail economy was this: telling the truth about your employer was a crime, but the behavior you reported was not. This was not a paradox. It was a policy. The legal architecture of 19th century America was designed with considerable deliberation to protect the private behavior of the wealthy from public exposure, regardless of whether that behavior was moral, legal, or defensible. The foundation of this architecture was the faithless servant doctrine. Under common law, a servant owed a duty of loyalty to the employer that extended beyond the performance of assigned tasks. This duty included an obligation of confidentiality. A servant who disclosed private information about an employer, even if that information was true, even if the disclosed behavior was illegal, could be prosecuted for breach of duty. The servant's obligation to keep silent was enforceable by law. The employer's obligation to behave decently was not. The implications were extraordinary. A housemaid who witnessed her employer beating his wife could be punished for reporting the beating to the press, while the employer faced no legal consequence for the beating itself, unless the wife chose to press charges, which the social and economic realities of the era made almost impossible. A valet who discovered that his master was embezzling from a business partner could be dismissed and blacklisted for sharing the discovery, while the embezzlement continued undetected. The law treated the servant's speech as a greater offense than the employer's conduct. The practical enforcement was brutal. A servant who was dismissed for cause received no references. Without references, finding new employment in domestic service was nearly impossible. The reference system functioned as a private blacklist, maintained not by any central authority, but by the informal network of wealthy households that shared information about their servants through word of mouth and through employment agencies. A servant marked as faithless, meaning one who had broken the confidentiality expectation, was effectively barred from the entire industry. This created a chilling effect that extended far beyond the individual cases. Servants who witnessed crimes, who observed abuse, who knew of financial fraud, remained silent not because they were loyal, but because speaking would destroy their livelihood. The law did not need to prosecute many servants to maintain control. It needed only to prosecute enough to make the risk visible. Blackmail statutes reinforce this asymmetry with particular severity. Under New York law, threatening to expose true information about another person in exchange for payment was a crime. The truth of the information was not a defense. This meant that a servant who knew that her employer was committing adultery and asked for money to keep silent was a criminal. The employer who was committing adultery was merely a sinner. The landmark case of Murray versus Beard, decided in 1886, established the principle with crystalline clarity. The court held that threatening to expose another person's private conduct, regardless of the truth of the allegation, constituted criminal extortion if the threat was accompanied by a demand for payment. The ruling made no distinction between true and false accusations. The crime was the threat, not the underlying behavior. This legal framework created the conditions for the servant information economy to function in precisely the way it did. Servants accumulated knowledge. They could not sell it without committing a crime. They could not disclose it without risking prosecution. They could be subpoenaed to reveal it in court proceedings, but only at the initiative of a legal adversary with the resources to bring a case. The servant was trapped between the knowledge they possessed and the law that prohibited them from using it. The system worked, after a fashion, as long as both sides accepted its terms. The employer paid a fair wage and dismissed the servant with adequate compensation. The servant maintained silence and departed with references that would allow future employment. But when the terms broke down, when a servant was dismissed without cause, without references, without severance, the system's fundamental contradiction was exposed. The servant had been punished for the employer's decision, but was legally prohibited from retaliating with the only weapon available, the truth. Legal historians Lawrence Friedman and Angus McLaren have documented the pattern extensively. The cases follow a depressingly consistent template. A servant is dismissed. The servant possesses damaging information. The servant attempts to leverage that information for compensation. The employer calls the police. The servant is charged with extortion. The employer's original behavior, which created the information in the first place, is never examined. The Victorian moral compromise that underlay this legal structure was not subtle. It was explicit. Society tolerated vice as long as vice remained invisible. The sin was not the act, but the exposure. A man could maintain a mistress for decades without consequence, as long as the arrangement stayed behind closed doors. The moment those doors opened, the person who opened them, not the person who was behind them, was punished. This was the legal world that made Colonel Mann possible. This was the legal world that made the Vanderbilt divorce testimony necessary. This was the legal world that allowed Harry Thaw to engineer a castle to contain screams. And this was the legal world that Maria Kayat shattered when she walked into a courtroom and told the truth about what she had seen. The faithless servant doctrine did not die with the Gilded Age. It evolved. Modern non-disclosure agreements, employment contracts with confidentiality clauses, and the entire apparatus of corporate secrecy are its direct descendants. The logic is unchanged. The person who sees is bound. The person who acts is protected. The evolution is traceable through specific legal developments. In the early 20th century, courts began applying the faithless servant doctrine to corporate employees, extending the principle from the domestic household to the business enterprise. A secretary who disclosed her employer's business strategies could be fired for cause and denied severance. A bookkeeper who revealed accounting irregularities to the press could be sued for breach of fiduciary duty. The servant had become the employee. The mansion had become the office. The bell pull had become the intercom. But the underlying architecture of enforced silence remained intact. Non-disclosure agreements, which proliferated in the late 20th century, formalized what the faithless servant doctrine had established informally. An NDA does not merely prohibit the sharing of trade secrets. which is its stated purpose. It creates a contractual obligation of silence that mirrors precisely the obligation that Gilded Age servants accepted as a condition of employment. The difference is that the NDA is signed. The servant's obligation was assumed. Severance packages represent the modernization of the hush money that Gilded Age employers paid to departing servants. A generous severance, offered in exchange for a signed release that includes confidentiality provisions, is functionally identical to the bequests that wealthy families made to long-serving domestics in the 19th century. The payment is for silence. The silence covers whatever the departing employee has seen. The transaction is the same, only the paperwork has changed. But the conditions that sustained the Gilded Age version of this system were already eroding. And the erosion came not from the courts or the legislature, but from the servants themselves. They were leaving. Chapter 10. The Servants Who Could Not Be Replaced. By 1910, the great families of New York faced a problem that no amount of money could solve. The servants were disappearing. The decline was statistical before it was personal. In 1880, domestic service employed more Americans than any other occupation. By 1920, it had dropped to third. By 1940, it would barely register in the top 10. The numbers told the story of a labor market in collapse. The causes were multiple and reinforcing. The electric washing machine, commercially available by 1908, eliminated the need for a full-time laundress. The gas range replaced the coal-fired stove and the team of kitchen workers required to manage it. Central heating removed the daily labor of carrying coal, managing grates, and clearing ash. The vacuum cleaner, the electric iron, the refrigerator. Each appliance displaced a category of servant. Each displacement removed a pair of eyes from the household. Immigration patterns shifted simultaneously. The great wave of Irish and Scandinavian women who had staffed American households through the 1880s and 90s slowed after the turn of the century. New arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe were more likely to enter factory work, which offered fixed hours, the company of fellow workers, and the dignity of a daily departure from the workplace. Living in your employer's home, subject to their schedule 24 hours a day, lost its appeal when alternatives existed. The apartment building dealt a structural blow. When families moved from freestanding mansions to apartment living, the servant quarters shrank from entire floors to single rooms, or disappeared entirely. A family that had employed 12 servants in a brownstone might employ 3 in an apartment. A family that had employed 3 might employ a single-day worker who arrived in the morning and left in the evening. The shift to apartment living reflected a broader change in how the wealthy understood their relationship to space and privacy. A mansion on Fifth Avenue was a statement of permanence and power. An apartment on Park Avenue, however luxurious, was a concession to practicality. The mansion required an army to maintain. The apartment required a staff. The army saw everything. The staff saw most things. The day worker saw almost nothing. Day workers changed the information economy fundamentally. A live-in servant saw everything because she never left. A day worker saw only what happened between 8 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. The continuous surveillance that had characterized the Gilded Age household was replaced by intermittent observation. The knowledge that servants accumulated became fragmented, partial, and far less valuable to anyone who might wish to exploit it. The social expectations surrounding domestic service also shifted. By the 1920s, the idea that a servant should be invisible, should use the back stairs, should never speak unless spoken to, began to feel not just old-fashioned, but vaguely un-American. The servant problem, as the press called it, was partly a labor supply issue, but it was also a cultural issue. Young women who might have entered domestic service in 1890 had other options in 1920. They could work in a department store. They could type in an office. They could operate a telephone switchboard. None of these jobs paid significantly better than domestic service, but all of them allowed the worker to go home at the end of the day and close her own door behind her. The First World War accelerated every trend. Women who had been in domestic service entered factories, offices, and government positions during the war and saw no reason to return to household employment afterward. The servant problem, which had been a recurring topic in society magazines since the 1890s, became an acknowledged crisis by the early 1920s. The families adjusted. They accepted smaller staffs, simpler meals, and reduced entertainment schedules. They automated, they simplified, and in doing so, they dismantled the very conditions that had created the servant information economy. Fewer servants meant fewer witnesses. Simpler households meant fewer secrets to conceal. Changed moral standards meant fewer behaviors that required concealment in the first place. The blackmail economy did not end because justice prevailed. It ended because the market collapsed. The supply of servants dwindled. The demand for silence decreased. The currency of secrets was devalued by a culture that was slowly learning to tolerate what it had once punished. But the human wreckage of the old system persisted. The children whose lives had been shaped by servant testimony grew up carrying the weight of words spoken in courtrooms decades earlier. And one of those children was about to transform the Vanderbilt name in ways that no previous generation could have imagined. Chapter 11. The Heiress Who Built Her Own Fortune. Little Gloria Vanderbilt grew up to put her name on the back pocket of a pair of jeans, and in 1979, those jeans earned more than her great-great-great-grandfather's servants made in 10,000 lifetimes. The sentence is not poetry, it is arithmetic. Gloria Vanderbilt's designer jeans generated more than $200 million in sales during their peak years. The annual income of a Gilded Age housemaid was roughly $300. 10,000 lifetimes of that wage equals $3 million. Gloria's jeans out-earned them nearly 70 times over. She did not accomplish this by inheriting. She accomplished it by surviving. After the custody trial of 1934, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt grew up in the household of her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, surrounded by art, culture, and the particular kind of emotional distance that characterized wealthy families who expressed love through institutions rather than embrace. She attended exclusive schools. She debuted. She married 4 times, to Pasquale Di Chico, a talent agent, to Leopold Stokowski, the conductor, 30 years her senior, to Sidney Lumet, the film director, and finally to Wyatt Emery Cooper, a writer from Mississippi with whom she had 2 sons. Her youngest son, Anderson Cooper, would become one of the most recognized journalists in America. He is a Vanderbilt without Vanderbilt money. The distinction is the family's epitaph. The arithmetic of the Vanderbilt decline is a lesson in the physics of inherited wealth. The Commodore died in 1877 with $105 million, the largest fortune in America. He left $95 million to one son, William Henry. William Henry doubled it to $200 million in 8 years and then divided it among his children. Those children divided it among theirs. By the 3rd generation, The individual shares were still enormous by any normal standard, but inadequate to support the lifestyle the name demanded. The mansions cost fortunes to maintain. The social expectations required constant expenditure. The income taxes introduced in 1913 took a portion that the Commodore had never anticipated. The estate taxes that followed took more. The breakers alone cost $7 million to build and tens of thousands annually to maintain. Marble House, Biltmore, Rough Point, Idle Hour. The mansions consumed wealth like furnaces consume coal. By the time Gloria's generation reached adulthood, the trust funds that remained were adequate but not spectacular. The fortune that had made the Vanderbilt name synonymous with American wealth had dispersed across dozens of heirs, each receiving a fraction of the original, each fraction diminished by taxes, maintenance, and the relentless entropy of inherited money. In 1973, 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, for the first family reunion ever held. Not one of them was a millionaire. The fortune that had once been the largest in the Western Hemisphere had vanished in less than a century. The Commodore had built an empire. His great-grandchildren toured its ruins. Gloria's response to this inheritance was to reject its terms. Rather than live as a diminished heiress, she built a career as an artist, an actress, and ultimately a fashion brand. The genes made her richer than her trust fund ever had. She earned her money. She did not simply receive it. The Breakers is a museum now. Tourists pay $29 for admission. They walk through the Great Hall with its 45-foot ceiling. They admire the platinum and gold leaf. And then they descend to the servants' quarters, where the rooms are small, the ceilings are low, and the bell board still hangs on the wall with each bell labeled with the name of a room. Not one of those bells rings anymore. The tour guides explain the call system. They describe the hierarchy. They point out the narrow back corridors where servants moved invisibly between floors. But they do not explain the information economy. They do not describe the currency of secrets. They do not mention that the woman who cleaned the bedroom possessed enough knowledge to destroy the family that built the house. That story has been cleaned from the mansion, along with the coal dust and the candle wax. What remains is architecture without its purpose, beauty without its cost. Gloria Vanderbilt died on June 17, 2019, at the age of 95. Anderson Cooper was at her bedside. She left an estate that reflected her own earnings rather than her family's inheritance. The woman whose childhood had been determined by the testimony of servants had outlived the system that produced them. But the system's logic had not died. It had merely changed its wardrobe. Chapter 12. The Price of Being Known. The servants' bells still hang on the walls of Newport's mansions, each one labeled with the name of a room, and not one of them rings anymore. They are relics now, historical curiosities. Docents point to them and explain that this one summoned the downstairs maid, and that one rang in the gentleman's study. Visitors nod and move on. The bells are charming. They suggest a world of order, hierarchy, and elegant service. They do not suggest what they actually were: nodes in a surveillance network that stretched across every bedroom, every study, and every private corner of the house. The Gilded Age servant economy was built on a fiction. The fiction was that human beings could be made invisible, that a woman who dressed you, bathed you, and heard you weep at 3 a.m. could be paid enough to become furniture, that a man who shaved your face and emptied your pockets could be trusted to forget what he found, that the nurse who counted your laudanum drops would count them forever without ever telling anyone the number. This fiction sustained an entire class of Americans for roughly half a century. From the consolidation of the great post-Civil War fortunes in the 1870s to the collapse of the servant labor market after the First World War, the wealthiest families in the country operated on the assumption that purchased silence was permanent silence. They were wrong. The fiction collapsed whenever its conditions were violated. When Colonel Mann offered servants better prices for their knowledge than their employers offered for their silence, the information flowed to Mann. When the divorce courts demanded testimony, the testimony came from the servants' quarters. When Harry Thaw tried to engineer a building to contain his crimes, the building's geometry entered the trial record. When Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt dismissed her French maid, the maid's knowledge walked out the door with her and straight into a witness box. Each of these events confirmed the same truth. Silence is not a state of nature. It is a transaction. And every transaction requires continuous payment. The faithless servant doctrine survives in modern American law. Its principles are embedded in every non-disclosure agreement signed by a corporate employee, every confidentiality clause in an executive's contract, every severance package that includes language about not disparaging the employer. The legal tools have evolved. The underlying logic has not. The employer still purchases silence. The employee still sells it. And the price is still determined by the value of the information being suppressed. The Social Register still publishes. Its annual edition, now a slim volume compared to its Gilded Age predecessor, still lists families who consider themselves the arbiters of acceptable society. The calling card system is dead, replaced by invitations managed through personal assistants and social media accounts managed through publicists. But the fundamental architecture remains. A small group decides who belongs, and the decision is enforced by exclusion. What has changed is not the system. What has changed is the scale. In 1890, the servant who knew Mrs. Astor's secrets could tell a gossip columnist. In 2026, the personal assistant who knows a celebrity's secrets can tell the internet. The audience has expanded from the 400 to 4 billion. The potential damage has scaled accordingly. The price of silence has risen. The cost of exposure has become incalculable. But the human dynamic at the center of the transaction remains identical. Someone with power requires the service of someone without power. The service requires proximity. Proximity generates knowledge. Knowledge generates risk, and risk eventually generates consequences. The Gilded Age servant economy was not an aberration. It was a prototype, the first full-scale demonstration of a principle that governs every workplace, every household, and every relationship in which one person knows more about another than the other wishes the world to know. The servants knew this. They knew it every morning when they emptied the pockets. They knew it every evening when they turned down the sheets. They knew it every time a bell rang and they walked the narrow corridor to answer it. They knew that the distance between the bell and the hand that rang it was the distance between power and vulnerability. And they knew that the hand which rang could also be stilled by the person who answered. The bells still hang on the walls, labeled, silent, waiting for a ring that will never come. But the question they asked, the question that echoed through every servant's hallway in every great house in America, has never been answered. What is your silence worth? The Gilded Age thought it knew the price. It paid in wages, in hush money, in settlements, in sealed testimony. It was never enough.